trying to say to you is if we ever want to really tackle racism, classism, and sexism, we're going to have to interrogate the most fundamental beliefs of our country. The idea of meritocracy, rugged individualism, right? Because ultimately those kinds of beliefs leave us unable, incapable of actually interrogating our world and understanding what's happening currently within it. And let me tell you why that's dangerous, right? See, here's the thing. It's very ironic, right, that mentality doesn't just hurt people of color, it actually hurts white folks. And this is what I want to conclude with because I want you to get this point. It's the most important point, perhaps. That's why I want to close with it. It's one thing to say that people of color are hurt by this system. That's obvious. And I could give you hours and hours of examples. I've already given you a few. But I want to suggest that not knowing the past, being ignorant about the history and how it brought us to this point is actually dangerous for whites as well. Why? Well, think about it.
Hello everyone, welcome once again to the channel. I hope wherever you are having a great time. Now, I've always brought for you clips of Tim Wise talking about some of the issues affecting black people in the United States. One of the reasons why I like bringing him here is the fact that he is among the very few white people who can speak boldly and openly about the plight of a black person in the United States. He has talked about different issues, but then in today's clip, he's highlighting a very sensitive topic, talking about the lie of meritocracy and why meritocracy never works in America and has never worked for black people. Let's watch this, then come back and share our thoughts.
It's one thing to say that people of color are hurt by this system. That's obvious. And I could give you hours and hours of examples. I've already given you a few. But I want to suggest that not knowing the past, being ignorant about the history and how it brought us to this point, is actually dangerous for whites as well. Why? Well, think about it. If you are told that wherever you end up is all about your own effort, at least if you're a person of color, you sort of know that's bullshit, right? Like people of color who know anything about their history know that it's way more complicated than that, right? They know that they've had people in their family that have been working hard for generations, don't have anything to show for it, right? People of color know they did some of the hardest work and continue to do some of the hardest work in this country every day and are not rewarded commensurate with the value that they create and produce. So people of color generally don't buy the myth, but white America has had the luxury of believing it. Even working class white people historically have been able to believe that, well, as long as I work hard, my kids will be better off than me. And their kids will be better off than them. And their kids will be better off. In other words, white folks have been able to take the idea of mobility for granted, right? At least horizontal mobility, right? So the guy says, well, my granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I'm working in the mine, my kid's gonna work in the mine. That's an expectation, isn't it? It's actually a sense of entitlement. By God, as long as we work hard, we'll always have stuff. People of color have never had the luxury of believing that. Black and brown folks have never been able to say, as long as I work hard, I'm sure I'll always have employment, right? But white Americans have been able to believe it. Now, why is that dangerous? It's dangerous because what happens if I come to believe that wherever I end up is all about me, and I've had the luxury of buying into that mythology because I'm a member of the dominant group that created the mythology, right? And I think that history flatters me because I wrote it, going back to what Baldwin said. And then all of a sudden the economy shifts and those jobs disappear, which is what's happening. What if all of a sudden some of those jobs become superfluous and anachronistic? What happens if those assembly line jobs are moving to other countries because it's cheaper to do the work there? What happens if the guy that owns the coal mine discovers that it's cheaper to just blow the top off the mountain with dynamite to get the coal and not have to use as many coal miners? Right? And then all of a sudden the coal jobs are going away because it's cheaper to get the coal in other ways than what you used to do. Now, if I'm a white guy that's always placed an emphasis on my own merit as the determiner of where I end up, and I'm struggling suddenly, if I've believed all my life that wherever I end up is all about me, and now I'm out of work for 26 weeks, 52 weeks, 99 weeks, as some were during the height of the recession a few years back, what do I do? Because now I'm internalizing shame, am I not? I'm internalizing blame because there's a voice in the back of my head that says, well, it's all your fault, remember, because wherever you end up is all about you. So if you're at the bottom, there must be something wrong with you. So what do I do with that shame and that pain? I have to deflect it, don't I? Otherwise, it's going to eat me alive. It's either going to eat me alive or I got to put it on you. Right? So now a politician comes along and says, I can take away your pain. Oh no, the pain that you're feeling, that's not your fault. When those black folks are out of work and when those Latino folks are out of work, that's their fault. That's because they're lazy. When you're out of work, it's also their fault. It's not about you, it's about them. So you go, oh good, and then you fall for it, right? But it doesn't really solve your problem to start scapegoating them. You're still dealing with that little voice in the back of your head, and then what happens? Well, think about this story you've all heard about, and I want to suggest this is deeply connected to whiteness and white supremacy and the system and history of white privilege. You've heard about the opioid crisis, right? All these white folks in small town America getting hooked on heroin. They started off with Oxy, right, because they got a prescription for some pain from a doctor, and then they got addicted. Now they're doing street heroin, right? And without all this sympathy, by the way, right? We're talking about, the opioid crisis. We got to help these poor salt of the earth white people who were hooked on dope. My God, we got to help them, right? We got to have rehab and treatment. We didn't do that in the 70s when we had a heroin crisis in black and brown poor communities. We just called people junkies and locked them up. We didn't do that in the 80s with crack. We didn't talk about rehab and treatment. We talked about prison, right? But with these white folks, we got all this sympathy. Well, good, it's about time. We should. But here's the problem. Why do you think the opioid crisis is happening to these folks? There was by the way, you may not have heard this, the biggest single correlated factor with support for Donald Trump in the election in a community by community sense was the number of people addicted to opiates in those communities. There was a one-to-one linear relationship between the degree of opiate addiction and the support levels for Donald Trump. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you had to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not what I'm saying. That's not my argument, though it's a fascinating hypothesis that some scholars in the room might want to study. That's not my argument. My argument is that what was Donald Trump? He was basically a human opiate, right? He was an opiate in human form. He walks into the room and says, I can take away your pain, right? By showing you who's to blame for it. What is an opiate? An opiate is pharmacologically meant to do just one thing, block pain receptors. Right? That's all it does. It blocks pain receptors. And here's a guy that comes along and says, I can block your pain receptivity by blaming these folks and letting you scapegoat them. The problem is opiates and Donald Trump as a human one don't actually solve the problem, right? If you got a crushed disc in your back and they put you on opiates to kill the pain, that's not going to fix your back. It's just going to get you through the really bad moments. If you have cancer and they put you on morphine or something to deal with the pain or some opiate to deal with the pain, that doesn't cure your cancer. It just gets you through the worst moments of it. Right? The same is true with all the supposed solutions that this president is pushing as a form of political opioid, right? But why are these folks doing it? Think about it for a second. There's a study that came out 2 years ago from Princeton, and it found a really interesting fact. From 1999 to 2013, there was this huge spike in death rates among one group of Americans only, and that was white, middle-aged, non-college educated working class people. Middle-aged, non-college educated, working-class whites saw this huge increase in death rates, 200,000 additional deaths compared to what we would have expected, because normally in an industrial economy like ours, the death rates are always going down because, the place is getting healthier and usually wealthier, and unless there's a famine or a natural disaster, the rates are normally going in a good direction. And they continued to do that for black folks. They continued to do that for Latinx folks. They continued to do that for Asian Americans. They continued to do that for wealthy whites, and even whites that weren't necessarily wealthy but had a college degree and some sense of hope for the future. It was just this one group that saw this seemingly inexplicable rise. And when that happened, there was a really interesting reaction. There's a conservative columnist for the New York Times who wrote about it and said, so much for white privilege. Look at these white people. They're dying. How can you say white people have privilege and advantage? They're the ones dying. And by the way, they were dying from opioid overdoses, heavy drinking, and suicide. That was the three main contributors to that death spiral, right? So how can you say there's privilege? These folks are killing themselves. Right? But actually, I think that was proof of a system of privilege, but a proof of a system of privilege that had finally started to let them down and they didn't know what to do with it, right? Because if I tell you all of your life that all you got to do is work hard and you'll make it, and suddenly you're not, and you have expectations that are up here, but the fulfillment is only about right here, what are you going to do? You don't know what to do with that pain. On the other hand, if I'm a person of color, I always knew that to get up here, I was going to have to hustle and grind. Right? That I always knew getting to a 7 or better on the 1 to 10 scale was going to take a hell of a lot of work. So if I'm a person of color and I'm already at a 5.5, I might be like, well, all right then. Things are looking up. But if I'm white and you told me I was going to have an 8 or a 9 or a 10 if I just worked hard and did everything and played by the rules, and now I'm only at a 5.5, oh, hell no. 5.5 wasn't meant for me. That was meant for those people. Now I can't handle it. So I either got to take it out on you or I take it out on myself. What I'm trying to say is that a system of inequality, which usually has worked for white people, has set us up and created a mentality of expectation and entitlement that can't always be fulfilled, right? A couple years back during the recession, Newsweek did a cover story about all these executives who'd lost their jobs, because it didn't just hit working class folks. A lot of middle management and even executives were getting laid off. They had this story about this white guy, right? He was interviewed, and he's talking about how he lost his job as the chief financial officer at some company. And he said, whenever I'm out there looking for work, I feel so ashamed, right? And he said, I feel like there's a big sign hanging around my neck, a neon sign that says, unemployed bum. I remember reading that and thinking, man, who told you that unemployed people were bums? You know, I know who didn't tell you that, unemployed people. I know who else didn't tell you that. Any person of color didn't tell you that. You know who told you that unemployed people were bums? You told you that unemployed people were bums. That's the irony of this system. The irony of this system is that it sets us all up to believe that certain outcomes are going to happen. And if you're white, you've had the luxury of believing them. And then when they don't, the level of frustration, frustrated expectations creates this kind of self-hatred that you take out on yourself, or hatred of others that you take out on them. But none of it solves the problem, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that inequality has a downside, not just for the people on the bottom, but even for some of the folks up here. Because the minute that it can't be sustained anymore, the minute that that system falls apart, and things do change, you know, the world is always changing. And if you're not ready for change, you're not ready for change. James Baldwin also said something about that. He was talking about how people of color sometimes, how black folks in particular, about whom he was writing, are the most prepared for crisis. And sometimes white folks are the least prepared. This is what he said. In this case, he was speaking about black folks. He said, that man who has to snatch his humanity every day out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it, learns something about himself in the process that no school and no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable, because in order to save his life, he has to learn to read the meaning behind the words, to read between the lines, to take nothing for granted. And Baldwin concludes by saying, when you are constantly having to survive the worst that life can bring, you cease to be afraid of what life can bring. The flip side of that is that when you haven't had to survive the worst that life can bring because you've been the favored group, and suddenly the worst that life can bring is staring you in the face, you have no idea how to cope with it. I guess my point is that white America should have been listening to black and brown folks a long damn time ago. And maybe if we had listened to their experiences and learned from their experiences, we wouldn't be having the existential meltdown that so many millions are, that would allow them to vote for a walking, talking, breathing human opiate, right? And we better figure this out. We don't have a lot of time. In 2042, if not earlier, right, half the country is going to be people of color and half are going to be white. That's a fact. No wall's going to stop that. Right? Half the country is going to be people of color, half are going to be white. How are we going to survive if half of the country, the people of color have, is still twice as likely to be unemployed? How are we going to survive if the people of color half is still 3 times as likely to be poor? How are we going to survive if the people of color half still has 1/15 the net worth? Answer, we're not going to survive. Right? So this thing about racial justice, this thing about equity, this ain't charity work. Right? This is radical self-help. This is about saving ourselves and the country that we claim to love. It is about, and I beg to remind you, not making America great again, but making America great for the very first and only time. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick, and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured, like many poor Europeans, for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture, and then they would be free labor, technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land. Not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No. They're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest. Because think about it, if I am a farmer who has to charge you $1 a day or $2 a week to work on your farm and harvest that tobacco or pick that cotton, but you can get a black person to do it for free because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low-income person. But they were told, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, How is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer. But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levy funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all, those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower Ninth Ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you'd want to pass a law. That law had never existed before. But now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply. You can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught. There was a lawsuit threatened and they got rid of the ordinance. But my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time and march on Baton Rouge and march on D.C. and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away.
Let me say that again. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants, who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up, and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another, or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote-unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people, right? So ultimately, the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness, and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. Give them a horse and a gun and a badge and make them feel big and powerful, right? They're still poor. They still don't have anything. They didn't pay the slave patrol well, right? Just exploited them, used them as a buffer between the elite and the other poor folks, particularly poor folks of color. And pretty soon, the rebellions that occasionally happened where black and white got together to overthrow the elite, those stopped because the divide and conquer had begun to work, right? You could turn people against each other by telling those poor white folks, they got to keep these black people in line. And so that divide and conquer gets initiated in the colonies. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward to the Civil War era. And you have, I'm from the South, right? My people, the elite in my part of the country, right, actually announced that the reason they wanted to break away from the Union and possibly go to war with their brothers and sisters to the North was in order to maintain slavery and white supremacy. They said that at the time. We lie about it now. And we say it had nothing to do with that. But of course, at the time, they didn't have any shame about it, so they just said it openly. Right? The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government was the great truth that the Negro was not the equal of the white man. So that's the reason the Confederacy was formed and existed. But here's the trick. If I'm rich and I want to go to war to protect my ownership in other human beings, my property, but you're poor and you don't own any enslaved people, why the hell would you go fight to protect my stuff? Because I'm a rich person. I'm not going to fight. Rich people don't go to war, right? Rich people get poor people to go to war for them, whether it's in 1860 or whether it's during the 1960s or whether it's today, right? Rich folks get doctors to write notes for them that say that they have heel spurs, and that's why they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that shit because he's sitting in the White House right now, right? Oh, I can't go fight. I have heel spurs. Send some poor kids to do that for me, please, right? So that's been a long-standing tradition. So the rich have to figure out a way to convince the poor to go fight for them. But that's a hard thing. That's like a hard sell, right? Like, how the hell, why would you do that? Why would you go fight to protect my property rights when you don't own anything? The only way you would do it is if that rich person comes to you and says, hey, listen, you gotta go fight because we gotta maintain our way of life, because if these people get free, they're gonna take your jobs. No, fool, they already got your job. That's how it works, right? Because if I'm white and I got to charge you $1 a day to work on the farm, but you can get a black person to do it for nothing because you own them, guess who got the job? Free got the job, right? So in a sense, poor white folks would have been better off joining with black folks to overthrow the slave system. That would have raised the wage floor of all working people. But they got tricked by rich white men telling them that their enemies were black and brown. Fast forward to the 1930s. And you have white labor leaders. They're not even the elite, right? The labor leaders are not the elite, but they're the elite within the labor movement. And even they had fallen for it at this point. So they didn't want to integrate their unions. And they would say things like, well, we can't have black people and Mexicans and Chinese folks in our unions because if we do that, it's going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. We have to maintain the integrity of our profession. No, fool, you need more people in the damn union is what you need. And if you don't let those folks in, guess what happens when you go out on strike? Who is the boss going to use to replace you? They're going to replace you with the very same black and brown folks that you didn't want to work next to, right? And so at the end of and then you're going to blame them for taking your job rather than the white rich dude for giving it to them, right? Divide and conquer, telling not rich white folks that their enemies are black and brown. And now we fast forward to the president. We got the president of the United States becoming president on the basis of that same rhetoric. Telling not rich white folks that the reason they don't have a job is because Mexicans took them, right? That's the argument. Keep in mind, there's been a net outflow of Mexican folk from this country, out of this country in the last 10 years. Right now, border crossings and actual in-migration at the lowest level they've been since the 1970s. So anybody who believes that is a damn fool, or somebody who does not understand how to do research on the internet, or someone who doesn't care, right? But he says the reason you don't have a job is those brown folks took them.
Wow, such a great lecture from Tim Wise. He has always advocated for equity and respect of black people. And that is why, as an anti-racism educator, I believe Tim Wise understands his craft and he has earned respect from black community in many ways. Share your thoughts about the topic down in the comment section. And if you're watching us for the first time, please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video and share. Thank you, and let's meet on the next one.